Aloha, my loves, and welcome back to another episode of Soulful Wahine. In today's episode, I want to examine the question, why do I feel guilty for choosing myself? We spend so much time encouraging people to choose themselves, protect their peace, set boundaries, and prioritize our own needs. And while I agree with all of those things, I think that we have accidentally left out one really important part of that conversation. Because what nobody prepares you for is what happens after you start to do those things. For so many people, choosing ourselves does not immediately feel empowering. If anything, it feels uncomfortable. It feels confusing. And sometimes it even feels wrong. Before long, that little voice in our head starts to say things like, am I becoming selfish? Am I hurting the people that love me? Why does something so healthy feel so bad? And as I've said in the other episodes, I don't think that we are asking the right questions, folks. And so today, I want to dive into that. I want to explore why so many of us feel guilty for choosing ourselves. Because before we decide whether guilt is actually telling us the truth, I think we first have to understand where that guilt even comes from. What if guilt isn't proof that you've done something wrong? Most of us have been taught that we need to treat guilt like a moral compass. So if I feel guilty, I must have hurt someone. If I feel guilty, I must be making a bad decision. But emotions don't always tell us what is true. Sometimes they tell us what is familiar. And I think that's where this conversation really begins. None of us are born believing that taking care of ourselves is selfish. Somewhere along the way, we learned that. Maybe it came from our family. Maybe it came from our culture. Maybe it came from relationships where your value was measured by how much of yourself you gave away. And the guilt doesn't just appear overnight. It was taught, which also means that it can be unlearned. One thing that I've noticed is self-preservation often gets mistaken for selfishness. And I think that we have confused the two for a really long time. Selfishness says only my needs matter, while self-preservation says my needs matter too. Those are not the same thing. But if you spent years putting yourself last, they can feel identical. And that's usually because we've connected love with sacrifice. And somewhere along the way, many of us learned that love meant self-sacrifice. Be the helper, be the strong one, keep the peace, and don't disappoint people. None of those messages are inherently bad, but when your worth becomes attached to how much you give, choosing yourself can start feeling like you're taking something away from everyone else, which makes boundaries feel much heavier than they actually are. Can any of you resonate with that? You want to play? Sorry, guys. I'm a mama, and my baby wants to play right now. Boundaries don't just change your behavior, they change relationships. When you've always been available, your absence gets noticed. When you've always said yes, your no tends to stand out. Not because you've become a different person, but because the relationship dynamic has shifted and changed. And that's where guilt can become really confusing for a lot of us. I want to throw this one out there, and I know that some of you might not agree with me. But someone else's hurt doesn't automatically mean that you have caused harm. I think this is one of the hardest truths for many of us to accept because people can genuinely feel disappointed by your boundary. Their feelings are real, their feelings are valid. But that doesn't automatically make your boundary unhealthy. Sometimes both things can exist at the same time. And that's the beauty and also the challenge of holding two truths at once. So, this is what I mean by duality. You can love your family deeply and still need boundaries. You can care deeply about someone and still decide that they no longer have access to all parts of you. You can honor where you come from without abandoning who you're becoming. Healing asks us to hold both, but holding both oftentimes comes with grief. We don't just grieve people, folks. Sometimes we grieve the old versions of ourselves. The versions that always said yes. The version that never asked for help and did everything on our own. The version that believed everyone else's needs comes before mine. Healing often requires us to say goodbye to identities that once helped us survive, which explains why healing doesn't always feel peaceful. I think one of the biggest things that I struggle with when it comes to social media, folks, is nowadays people like to package up the idea of healing into this cute box of, oh, it's aesthetic, oh, it's cute, oh, it's yoga, it's all these things. And while yoga and mindfulness and other things can be helpful and are a part of the healing journey, healing is not pretty. Healing is ugly. It's painful. I literally tell my clients when they come to therapy, I'm going to be honest with you. We're going to get dragged through the mud. But I'm going to be here right alongside with you. And you don't have to do it alone. And so I just want to throw out there, folks, that if you are currently on your healing journey and it's not pretty, it's not cute, that typically means you're doing something right. Because again, healing is not meant to be aesthetic. It's not meant to be pretty. It's not meant to be cute. Healing is meant for us to grieve the old versions of ourselves so that we can become the best version of ourselves. Following along? And so maybe the goal isn't to stop feeling guilty. Maybe the goal is learning not to let guilt make every single decision for you. Because guilt will often show up before growth feels comfortable. That doesn't mean that we're headed in the wrong direction. Sometimes it means that we're actually heading somewhere new, somewhere unfamiliar. And I think that's the reminder that so many of us need to hear. Choosing yourself is not the opposite of loving others. It might actually be one of the healthiest ways to love our loved ones. Because relationships built on resentment eventually break, folks. Relationships built on fear eventually exhaust us. But relationships where both people are allowed to feel like they can fully exist, those are the ones that have room to grow. So before we call ourselves selfish, I think we need to ask a different question. Instead of asking, why do I feel guilty? Maybe we need to ask, who taught me that choosing myself should feel guilty in the first place? Those are two very different questions. One assumes that there is something wrong with us, while the other invites curiosity about our story. And once we become curious, we stop treating guilt like it's the final answer. Guilt does not always deserve to be in the driver's seat. Of course, I think guilt deserves our attention, but I don't think it deserves our obedience. You see the difference? Not every guilty feeling needs to be acted on. Sometimes guilt is simply letting you know you're doing something different than you've ever done before. And different doesn't always mean wrong. So, how do we know when we're actually choosing ourselves in a healthy way? One question that I often come back to is, does this decision protect my well being, or does it come at someone else's expense? Because those are not the same thing. Protecting your peace is not harming someone. Protecting your energy isn't rejecting someone. And protecting your mental health isn't abandoning someone. Those distinctions matter, folks. And I think that's where so many of us finally begin giving ourselves permission. And when it comes to permission, folks, especially for Polynesians or really any ethnic culture, I've noticed that maybe for a lot of us, nobody ever gave us permission to even rest, to disappoint people, to change your mind, to stop over explaining yourself, to become someone different than who everyone expected you to be. So maybe healing looks like giving yourself that permission now. Because healing isn't just changing your behavior, it's also about changing your relationship with yourself. One thing that I always let my clients know is when it comes to healing, there is going to be a grief process. And healing asks us to mourn more than we expected. I think one of the most overlooked parts of healing is the grief aspect of it. Not just grieving people, but grieving the version of ourselves who believed that we had to earn love by being everything for everyone else. The version who stayed quiet, the version of us who carried more than we should have, and the version of us who believed that our needs had to wait. We weren't weak, we were surviving with what we knew. And I think we now deserve our own compassion, not criticism. Because maybe healing isn't becoming someone completely new, but rather finally allowing ourselves to become who we've always been. Does that make sense? I want to throw something out to you folks. Self-compassion sounds different than guilt. Guilt says you're failing people, while self-compassion asks us, what do I need right now? Guilt says you're being selfish, while self-compassion asks, how have I been abandoning myself? Again, those are very different conversations, and the answers might surprise you. I don't want any of you folks to leave this episode believing that choosing yourself will never be uncomfortable. Because if I'm being honest, there will be a lot of uncomfortable moments, especially in the beginning. And especially if we were never taught how to choose ourselves. And especially if you have spent years believing that your worth came from being self-sacrificing. Healing isn't always comfortable, but discomfort is not the same thing as danger. And that's the reminder that I hope you carry with you. That just because something feels new and something feels uncomfortable, that does not mean that that uncomfortability is dangerous for us. If there's one thing that I hope you folks remember, it's this. You can love your family deeply and still need boundaries with them. You can care about other people's feelings without making them your responsibility. You can choose yourself without having to choose against the people that you love. Those things are not opposites, okay? Again, it's about having that duality. Because healing isn't about loving others less. It's about finally making room to love yourself too. Not instead of everyone else, but alongside everyone else. You were never supposed to be the one person left out of your own care. And I hope you remind yourself of that. I always talk about pouring into yourself because if we're not pouring into ourselves, folks, again, this is where resentment comes in. And being a therapist, I have worked with people from different walks of life. And I'll tell you all right now, resentment is one of those emotions that is very, very hard to come back from. Okay? I want to leave you all with a question, and I just want you to reflect on it whenever you have some time. The next time that guilt shows up after choosing yourself, instead of immediately asking, "What did I do wrong?" I want you to try to ask yourself this: what belief is this guilt trying to protect? You might discover that what you're protecting isn't your relationships, but rather an old version of ourselves that's ready to be gently outgrown. Again, just something for you all to reflect on. Before we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you all with one final thought. If you've been carrying guilt every time that you choose yourself, I hope you remember that guilt isn't always asking you to go back. Sometimes it's simply showing up because we're walking a path that we have never walked before. And here's the thing, folks. New paths almost always feel unfamiliar, but that doesn't mean that they're the wrong paths. Okay? So the next time you set a boundary or you say no, or you make a decision that honors your well-being, instead of immediately asking yourself, "Why do I feel so guilty?" try asking, "What part of me is afraid of becoming someone I've never been allowed to be?" And I just want all of you to learn how to become more curious with yourself before you start to critique yourself. Okay? If this conversation resonated with you, please know that you are never alone in this journey and that you are always seen here. This is a community that I am so proud to have, and I never want any of you to feel like you're going at this alone, because you're truly not. As always, folks, until next time, mahalo and aloha.